I can tell you while I was circulating that these conversations were all excellent. What a phenomenal group we have assembled here, and how impressed I was with the diligence with which people took on this task. Really great. This could have dominated our entire day, and we would not have exhausted this process. This framework that Ron and Scott and his team have been developing over these decades is so worthwhile, and this is just the next iterative step. Okay, so we're going to try to, in a brief way, have a report from each group, and I've just assigned numbers arbitrarily, and so group number 1, the spokesperson is Lydia. Are you here, Lydia?
I came this way. Is that easier?
Yes, that'd be great.
Okay.
There's Lydia.
Hi, I'm Lydia. Is this on? Can you hear me? Okay, great. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Lydia Hopper. I'm from Lincoln Park Zoo. We spent, I would say, the majority of our time talking about the shorter of the two questionnaires, the institutional questionnaire. So I'm just sort of going to quickly go through our thoughts on some of the questions. And the first was, although we liked what it was asking, and this is the one which is, does it appear that there is a clear commitment to animal welfare at the executive and management levels? We thought that essentially just left it to being a yes/no question, but it was pretty vague, and we thought a better way to ask it might be to ask, do all members at the board or at the executive level have a consensus of what is meant by animal welfare? So not just whether you support it, but also that you're all in agreement as to what you mean. We thought the second question was clear. The third question, we thought that maybe there could be some room, particularly in the second part, to say just because you don't have an animal welfare dedicated role, that doesn't mean you're not committed to animal welfare, and maybe making it explicit that the people responding could talk about other roles such as research scientists, animal behaviorists, trainers, roles like that that may incorporate a proportion of their time into studying animal welfare. The fourth question, we thought the second part was quite vague, and maybe it could just be incorporated in one question and ask, do you give that training? And if so, is it differentially given to different people with different roles or at different levels? And then we also thought that what's really key to this is also asking whether you do evaluation of your training. It's one thing to give that training, but really you need to know whether people are evaluating it. And the other thing was that with the 10th question, there was no real definition of what was meant by compassionate conservation. I know we've talked about it a lot today, and so maybe everyone in this room now knows, but we thought that might be quite a vague or an unwieldy term, and so some sort of definition of compassionate conservation should be given. And then we spent a little bit of time also discussing the exhibit questionnaire, and we were thinking specifically of penguin exhibits. And sort of globally it was asked what people were using as their baseline to define an animal's species typical behavior. Was this relating back to other captive animals of that species, or are we trying to represent and elicit wild behaviors? Because those are two very different things, so that sort of needs to be discussed. There was also no discussion in this questionnaire about whether an institution recognized personalities or individual differences, and if so, how they tailored their welfare program to individual animals. And there was also no questions discussing keeper-animal relationships either, and how the animals responded to the keepers, if they were fearful or if they were reticent to approach them. And then just a couple of very specific points. We thought question number 6 was very broad. There's a lot of variation in what could be thought of as choice and what could be thought of as all the different behaviors. And so maybe it might be better to ask about control, and whether the animals could have some control over where they can be and what they can do and when they can do it. And just finally, really quickly, the 12th question, we thought it might be nice to split this into 2 parts. One, do you have a training program? And then the second part, if you do, is this always on exhibit? Is this sometimes behind the scenes? Like, what is the purpose of that training? Is it educational, or is it entertainment? Is it veterinary? Is it, just to really allow people to sort of tease apart those. So those are our thoughts. So we thought overall good, just there was some sort of vague elements to some of the questions.
Thank you, Lydia, and that's great. I think what we'll do is rather than take questions to each group, we'll have everybody report, and then we'll see if there's time for a discussion. Group 2 is Brittany. Is that Brittany coming down, or? This may work out well with the microphone. It might work out nicely. Unless you have long legs, by the way, I advise that you go around the back.
Thanks. Hello. I am Brittany Peet. I'm Deputy Director of Captive Animal Law Enforcement with the PETA Foundation. We talked a lot more sort of philosophically, particularly about the first document, the institutional welfare policies. One of the things that we all sort of agreed on is that it lacked a definition of terms, and it really should kind of come with a separate document that includes both a definition of terms and perhaps measures or examples of some of these things. So what in an acquisition, transfer, and transition policy might reflect a commitment to the welfare of individual animals. So perhaps a list of things from other facilities that reflect that, or what might reflect that. We also discussed that it may be helpful to use the second form as a guide for this first form. So do the measures in the second form reflect a clear commitment to animal welfare? So that sort of thing. And so on the first form, we discussed that there need to be evidence-based measures for each criteria because as it is, it's very objective. And then sort of on the same note there, depending on who fills out the form, that person may lack objectivity. So if it's not an independent person, and even if it is, their philosophy may differ very much on what animal welfare is versus the facility that's being evaluated. So I think that having a definition of terms would help out there. We also discussed that it might be difficult to apply to smaller facilities. For example, if a facility has only one keeper, it may be difficult for them to implement advanced animal welfare training. We also discussed that, especially as to the second form, it may work better as an electronic tool. On paper, it might be a little bit unwieldy and difficult. And with an electronic tool, you could also, if it was an iPhone app or something like that, you could incorporate photographs and it would be easier to upload the data. And some of the more scientific types, of which I am not, made a lot of really good points, including that this is more of an evaluation tool, and it's not looking specifically at behaviors or things that are truly a measure of animal welfare, and so that it might be good to incorporate some things like that into this form as well. So hopefully I'm not missing too many things.
That's great. Thank you, Brittany. Ron.
Misunderstandings, because obviously we didn't explain a couple of things well enough. So when Scott and I went over this, we talked about the key pieces. We didn't share with you the narrative that goes along with this, that has all of the detail that we're talking about. And you're absolutely right. This is not meant to do an assessment because we can't. You would need to do a study to see for each individual animal whether in fact the welfare is compromised or not. So this is an evaluation tool of the basic program. You may or may not capture in the second document glimpses of things which suggest there are real problems. You certainly can capture in the second document things which in most situations would lead to a problem, like if there is an animal that's living in a place where the substrate is inappropriate, even if you don't see stereotypic behavior or you don't see wounds, one can likely assume that does happen. But there is a full narrative that goes along with this that explains all of the pieces. So I understand why there was confusion about that.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Brittany. Is Group 3, Kathy, are you here or there? And actually, may I ask, since we're going to be doing this, can I ask Group 4 Don and 5 Chris to come on down and wait in the wings?
Thank you. There's a microphone.
Yes. You can come on it. Come on right now. And by the way, I also want to say, it's my recommendation. Even if you feel like as you go further along, even if you feel like your groups are starting to repeat, it might be worthwhile to take 5 seconds to just say we endorse the following point already. That will give the authors a sense of the relative magnitude of the feedback. Kathy.
My name is Kathy Williams, and I'm the senior veterinarian for the Duke Lemur Center. And our group spent the majority of time on the second form as opposed to the first one. And we were looking in with regard to a gorilla exhibit. So some of the comments that we had were for B and for C with regards to how long animals are in substantial portion of non-primary areas, to be a little more specific to identify. You say substantial, but what does that really mean? And that could change by animal. So just be a little more specific on that one. And then with 6, also with regards to whether animals have the option to choose between performing different behaviors, feeding and shifting, that those are very different, and the answers might be very different, again, by the exhibit and the species. So separating those out would be beneficial to give a little more clarity to the answer for that one. And going on in number 7, with regards to animals behind the scenes in non-primary holding areas, is it adequate space for the amount of time that the animal's in them? We felt that it really depended on what the animals were doing in that space during that time. Was it primarily the time that they were sleeping, or was it a time when they were going to be active, but they were in a more confined space? So a little bit more clarification of that, of when animals were in those other areas, what was their activity level, and what would they normally be expected behaviors that they would be expected to be doing in that period of time. Question 12, operant and conditioning training. We felt that it was training for veterinary procedures, training for husbandry procedures, and training for shows are very different. And so we thought that if it was a 12 ABC sort of outline, that would allow the questionnaire or the person conducting that evaluation to have a better understanding of how training is used and for what kinds of methods, and how that would impact the animals and their welfare. There were a couple of things we felt were not in here that might be helpful to have in here. One was a comment about what the substrate of the exhibit is, and whether it was a manipulable or organic substrate that would either benefit the animal welfare in some way or not. And I think there's some inherent conflict in that, but probably should be considered. With regards to if it's organic, it's great for manipulative behaviors and things like that, but might have adverse implications for veterinary welfare or parasite management, that sort of thing, but probably worth mentioning for consideration. There was also no questions in here about animal health and animal health procedures. And since that is one of the 3 components, if you will, of animal welfare, that some questions related to that. One of the things that was discussed was, were there chronic health problems within the exhibit that were thought to be contributable to the environment? That might be a valuable question to add. And something from my own personal experience is how are veterinary exams conducted, and are there ways that those could potentially be improved to decrease stress or anxiety for the animals? A comment was to indicate square footage of the exhibit, and I put in there 3D dimensions because that varies on species. Although my own feeling is that it's unless there's a really specific consensus on what appropriate square footage is, you can get more information, but it has to be interpreted within the context of the species. So those were the major things. We all thought 14C was a great question about feedback process of behavioral data.
Great.
So we really liked that question.
Thank you very much, Kathy. I see that Group 4 Don is already ready, so.
Yeah. So apologies, Ron, I'm probably going to say exactly what you don't want me to say. But the good news is Ron was there with us the entire time. We were in the lunchroom, and every 2 minutes the movie would come on. Hi, I'm Ron Kagan. We'd have to turn him off and start over. So we had some similar comments. We need to have a shared understanding of language, which I think you addressed. One of our questions was, is this an internal self-assessment or an external peer assessment? And either way, we felt that all the questions could be answered yes. So our suggestion there, and this is the first sheet, sorry, but additional columns with options would be beneficial. So even if it was a trained person who was very, very objective, that maybe there need to be more columns. And we don't have more detail than that, but we just felt like you needed to give more options somehow. Jumping to the second sheet, which followed, we decided to just go with a 30,000-foot view, if you will. And so our summary, I think I've got 6 points. Again, subjective language, especially the word appropriate, and so need to have a shared understanding of the language so that there's objectiveness there. We felt that number 2, something like this is an endpoint after interviewing keepers, doing behavioral assessments, and all sorts of stuff, and then this becomes part of the feedback loop. So you've got all the data behind you, and then you're going forward with this kind of questionnaire, and then you're going back to the staff, and you're doing that continuous improvement feedback that Jim Gesualdi talks about in his book. Number 3, we think this is for interpretation of data that follows from the last point, not for data itself. So then you need trained personnel. And we talked about trained personnel for a while and quality control. And we decided it doesn't need to be like trained taxa specific or trained animal welfare specific personnel. It needs to be trained personnel who are trained in how to find the network of people that they need to answer the questions. But we came back to trained personnel for quality control. I think this is significant that a list of checkboxes like this can lead to a group of gaps and what animals are missing versus focusing on what makes animals thrive. So we had a little bit of a conversation about kind of the good to great direction of finding positive stuff and improving on that instead of kind of focusing on the negatives. Individual humans, number 5, individual humans could use this table and give different answers for the same animal in the same space at the same time. It gets back to quality control and how you're treating this. And then number 6, even though there might be shared language, if you're going to use this kind of in zoos in other countries or whatever, the language is trust and verify. So make sure that you've got plenty of room to accumulate your documentation, which I think Jim Gesualdi also addresses in Excellence Beyond Compliance, is document, document, document. Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you, Don. Group 5, Chris, and would Lily and Mike come on down and be in place, please?
Hi, folks. I'm Chris Draper from the Born Free Foundation in the UK. And just to give you a bit of background from me, this is a personal view. I've spent a lot of time in the UK hammering the British government for using a form a bit like this in our zoo licensing system. So I've got some fairly strong opinions on it, and I have to say it's a Herculean task that's been undertaken here. The one thing I will say is I've spent so long reviewing things like this, I haven't yet found a better system. So this sort of the questionnaire type framework is probably the only way of doing it, but the devil's in the detail. So just to pick up on some themes that have already been touched on before, there is an absolute requirement for specificity. Language that leaves any room for subjectivity is problematic. So adequate or appropriate or substantial, all these terms need clear definitions. I would avoid presence or absence of policies. That's not interesting. What's interesting is the content of those policies. Obviously, the absence is interesting, but again, devil's in the detail there. Does the zoo have an animal welfare concern reporting process? That's a very key question, but it needs to be clear that everybody at the zoo knows that exists. The idea of the director saying, yes, my door is always open to anyone that has a concern, that doesn't cut to the bottom of this. There was a general feeling that these questions could be answered very differently by different individuals, of course, external people, and different individuals within the zoo, in the hierarchy of the zoo, would answer these very differently. With any of these sort of systems, in my experience, there's a risk of auditing the zoo's own audit. And if the zoo's own audit is not good enough, all you're doing is just confirming their mistakes. So you're somewhat reliant on the information you're receiving, unless you're observing the animal's behaviour over a long period of time. You're reliant on the report from the keeper or from the researcher or whatever. So just to be aware of that as a potential pitfall. I have to say, apart from being critical, there are some key things that have been picked out that are really good. The emphasis on the 24-hour period, picking up on the timeshare aspect, the rotating of animals through an enclosure is something that is so often overlooked in these sort of assessments. There's a need for, again, the subjectivity is also dependent on knowledge, and I can say again from personal experience that even experts within the field, so UK government zoo inspectors, who are all government appointed, mostly veterinarians, will differ greatly in their interpretation of questions such as these, and their knowledge of what and consideration of what is and isn't appropriate. So finally, the other thing is this, it's an audit of a time slice, I guess, but even questions like, do the animals, is there evidence of stereotypic behaviour? Who's reporting that? Is that the observer that's doing the audit? Is that going to be reliant on the reporting from the keepers? And somebody made a very key point that one of the things that might add value to this process is undertaking it both independently but also with almost a zoo interpreter, either at the top level or preferably at the bottom level, the keeper level, who can give you their version of whether there are any animal welfare problems that they're aware of that you'd not be able to pick up as an auditor. Okay, I think that covers most. Oh, sorry, just one last thing. Currently, there's a yes, no, not clear. I would suggest more of a traffic light system. So yes with reservations, no, and not clear, something like that. And also be clear in terms of the welfare problems. I appreciate that this is focusing on enclosures where other systems have tried to do this at a zoo level, which is far too broad. This is one of the advantages in this approach, is that it's focused down on enclosure level, exhibit level. Even there, it may not be able to. You may not be able to accurately say that each animal applies. That something applies to each animal, and so perhaps considering some mechanism to report the extent to which it applies. So, for example, the UK system is very zoo-based, and it's yes or no, and you don't have any clue whether there's a welfare problem that affects one animal or all the animals in the zoo. Compare that with USDA, where they with animal welfare violations, they explain the number of animals affected. That's a far more important and efficient method of reporting this. So I would suggest incorporating some aspect of that in this. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much, Chris. We have two more to go. Is Group 6 Lily?
My name's Lily. I'm a grad student at Michigan State. We didn't have any particular critiques of any individual questions, but had some more general ideas. In particular, one thing that came up was the questionnaire sort of focuses on zoos that might already have a welfare program in place. But for zoos that don't already have a welfare program, a question that comes up is how much commitment are they going to put towards welfare as opposed to animal care, for example, or perhaps their other programs, considering that zoos have limited time and resources. And then in this case, that maybe the institutional assessment may act better as a guideline or perhaps a self-assessment that zoos can use to start building their own welfare program. Or then perhaps it could be useful to have both, like the outside person coming in and assessing the institution as well as an internal assessment. Another question that came up is that the institutional welfare assessment is very broad, and that a lot of zoos can have extremely good welfare programs for perhaps their primates, but other animals might be neglected, such as amphibians or lizards and turtles. And then another thing that came up too is that, especially in non-Western countries, this assessment has limited applications, particularly like in India or Sri Lanka, where maybe the term welfare is not really defined or understood. And then maybe in that case, rather than a welfare assessment, what would be more useful is education about welfare and more help in just getting a welfare off the ground and getting it understood what welfare is. And as for we had less time to talk about the individual species welfare thing, but one thing that came up was that this was a really long list with a lot of very specific things. And in one of the earlier talks, it came up that rather than grading the facility, maybe it's better to grade the animal itself. Like, for example, grading lameness in cows rather than assessing what the facility looks like sharp edges in the cow's stall. So yeah, one thing like we thought stereotypies was a pretty important measure of stress, whereas that was just sort of got lost a little bit in 15 questions being just one question in there. And that a score on an individual species can be really useful for prioritizing which animals to focus on first in terms of welfare. And I think that sums up pretty quickly what we discussed.
That was great. Thank you very much, Lily. And our last group, number 7, is reporting is Michael.
All right, I'll keep it quick because a lot of these things have already been covered, but we spent most of our time as well on the first policy document. And there are a few things actually that haven't been mentioned. So one thing is that we thought it might be important to have policies, to ensure the transparency and openness so that you are open with your policies so that people actually know what's going on and there's not any kind of black box effect. And another thing is to be really consistent in all aspects of your animal welfare policy. So if you're going to really promote yourself as being a champion of animal welfare, you need to make sure that you're doing it not only for the animals in your care, but also kind of across the board, including things like your pest control, where you're getting the food that you're serving in your cafeteria. And another idea was how you're incorporating welfare into your education program and making sure that it's really kind of a core component of your institution in all aspects. We had a few other things, kind of briefly, it was already mentioned, to make sure that you don't only kind of have an animal welfare officer, but to make sure that you're getting someone who's trained maybe especially in animal behavior and welfare. And also that if you have an animal welfare reporting process, that it might be good to have both kind of a separate staff one and a public one, and make sure that you kind of have a form for both of those. In terms of the second document, this one we had a little bit less time, but a few points are that some of these questions don't necessarily apply across all species, as was already mentioned, and particularly a lot of species in aquariums, so things like bony fishes, they just live in their environment. There's no kind of moving them around, so some of these questions may not always apply. We were also concerned, we weren't sure exactly, there's no real mention, as some of the other groups said, about health issues and where those might fit into this kind of assessment. And again, as some other groups have already mentioned, there's a lot of focus here on kind of the inputs to animal welfare without necessarily looking at the outcomes, which may actually be more relevant in terms of assessing animal welfare. And our final point was that we might want to actually consider incompatible species. So we don't want to have prey species, housed right next to predator species, and making sure that any kind of mixed species exhibits are also appropriate. And so I think that about sums up all of our points as well.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you very much. Stand by for just a moment where we think about where we are.
We're obviously off schedule, and we'll figure out how to get back on it. So let's open this up for a couple of minutes to just general questions, comments. To clarify again, there is a narrative, and you also have a copy of the chapter that was written about the challenges of zoo animal welfare. All of the issues that have been covered in the discussion are all in there as important issues. They can't all show up on a evaluation documents. So this does require that somebody knows animal welfare when they go and they do this audit. What we also can't do is do a full assessment of what in fact is the well-being of an animal, because that would require a major study on each of the animals. So this is meant as a quick tool to get a sense of, do the conditions seem to be supporting what would lead to good well-being. You may very well see clear signs that actually an animal has poor welfare, but at least this will tell us whether the basic conditions are there.